Well, yeah, I am so excited and honored to have Admiral Mike Mullen, the 17th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for the United States, joining us as our keynote fireside chat here. So, Admiral Mullen, such an honor to have you, and thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be with you. I'm actually very much looking forward to the time.
Thank you. We wanted to try to touch on three key themes that really across your, I believe it was 42 plus years of service towards the United States and all your leadership running mission critical organizations. And so the first theme I wanted to spend a few minutes on was, what is it like leading these mission critical teams? And obviously you began your career commanding various ships in the US Navy and ultimately culminated in leading our entire armed forces, I think approximately 2.2 million personnel. And so, like, what do you feel like are the most important traits for successful leadership when you're leading these sorts of mission critical organizations?
When I was very young, when my career started, I had a group that, I was in charge of what we call on a U.S. Navy destroyer division. It was probably 14 back then. It was all men. And the principles that I applied then to get to know my people, to understand their jobs, to depend on them, to trust them in what is, when you're going to see a very dangerous environment, is those principles actually I stayed with right through the time that I was chairman and responsible for 2.2 million men and women, with some number of hundreds of thousands deployed and a couple 100,000 deployed in a combat environment. So investing my time in them, and philosophically the way I did that was I invested in them, tried to make sure they had everything they needed to do their job, tried to understand their job. And in doing that, they then, and be very clear about what the mission is. And one of the messages today is you can't communicate enough. Someone says, say something 1,000 times, say it thousands of times, because communication clarity is really key. But so clear guidance to them. What is the mission? What are we doing? And then turn it over to them to accomplish it. They've got to have the resources. They've got to have the people, clarity of what they're doing, those kinds of things. And that kind of, and you would say, okay, easier for 14 men. When I'm a young guy, probably not as easy as, one would think when you're starting out. But that was the same thing I did over 4 years as chairman, to be out in the field, to understand, particularly in the war zone. I'm literally putting young men and women in a position to sacrifice their life for our country, and making sure they have the resources, making sure I'm listening to them in terms of what they need to accomplish their job. And then from a leadership standpoint, doing everything I can to make sure they have exactly what they need. I also want to understand, because you talk about mission critical, and these kinds of the kinds of situations just about everybody I'm speaking to are involved in, it involves risk. And so leaders have to evaluate risk. And there's nothing, certainly with this mission critical, that doesn't involve risk. And you have to decide whether it's too much risk and you're not going to do it, or you understand the risk. I call it calculated risk. And then you apply the team against whatever that situation is as best you possibly can to generate the kind of success that you want.
Yeah, I actually want to jump straight to one of the, I think for most of us, as Americans, this iconic moment during your span is leadership of the Department of Defense, which was the iconic Bin Laden raid. I actually just wanted to quickly flash on the screen here this famous image from the White House. So obviously you're standing behind President Obama here. You talked about like leading these teams directly into harm's way. Like, can you talk to us a little bit about the build up to this, making those decisions that you're going to take, the approach that you did? I know there was discussion about using some sort of airstrike or missile attack. What was it like making those decisions? And what was it like being in that room?
Well, this is, people ask me about that photo. And the reason it is iconic is because it really does capture the tension and the intensity. And I think the president's expression, or the president's face, captured an awful lot of that, not just the president himself, but everybody in the room. But it is for a mission like that, and this is I teach leadership here in Annapolis, and one of the things I talk to the young seniors about, who are about to go out, become commissioned, and lead sailors and Marines, is the more significant the decision, the harder you have to work at it, and quite frankly, the more views you need to pull into the room, the diversity of views. Leaders make better decisions the more diverse options that they have and consider. And this actually, so this is in May. The previous August was when the intelligence first started to become available. And in fact, I wasn't involved in that at all. It was kept so secret that it was then CIA Director Panetta and a handful of people from the CIA that interacted with the president, and maybe one or two other people on his team. In January, the president brought myself in, another smaller group, brought Gates in, myself, and Admiral Bill McCraven, who was the head of the Special Forces, Special Forces Command, what we call JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, at the time. And he was going to conduct the raid, or he was going to have the team that conducted the raid. But secrecy, and I talked about risk earlier, secrecy was critical, because bin Laden, it turns out, we didn't know where he was. But when we found out where he was and all about it, he'd been there a long time. And his aides, quite frankly, were recommending that he leave because he'd been there such a long time. And obviously he didn't. So the secrecy piece was one thing. And then, as the senior leader in the country, military leader in the country, with the responsibility to make a recommendation to the president on whether we should go, and if we went, how should we go, I immersed myself in the details of this read. McCraven, they rehearsed this thing to a fare thee well, exceptionally high risk. I give the president a lot of credit. It was a bet the presidency decision, because one, we didn't have a smoking gun. He said it best, I think it was a 50-50 proposition. And two, if it had failed, I think it would have cost him his presidency 18 months later. That's just my view. But at the same time, at the same time, I really invested myself in understanding the details and knowing the people. I went to the final dress rehearsal, out in the desert. I looked the 50 SEALs in the eye, met each of them personally, wanted them to know that the military leadership of the United States of America was behind them. And I had every confidence they could pull that off. And it was that level of knowledge about that decision, which was to send in the raiding team as opposed to a bomb or some other precise smaller weapon, that I strongly recommended. That's what the president decided. And obviously the rest is history. But it was an extraordinary moment by an exceptionally highly trained team to execute this. And even given that, and he doesn't get enough public credit, the guy that saved that mission was a helicopter pilot. And those two pilots, who I had also met, had over 6,000 hours, in those kinds of helicopters. And because he was able to keep that helicopter upright, and what we missed, even with all that preparation, and Murphy always shows up, what we missed was how hot it would be once we got into the compound, inside the walls, and there wasn't enough air for him to keep that helicopter up. So he had to set it down. And then he set it down with the tail on the wall, as you may recall, on top of the wall. That allowed the SEALs to depart the helicopter and execute the mission, even though they were off plan in terms of exactly how it was going to happen. That usually happens as well. So it was an extraordinary evolution with a very, very positive, critical outcome, bringing that guy to justice.
Yeah. I feel like you were known as chairman about, I think that the terminology you use is the pointy end, and like getting out there, meeting your teams in the field. I think one of the first things you did when you began your stint as chairman was actually go to Afghanistan and talk to the field leadership, right? So can you talk a little bit about like the importance of being on the front lines, getting that information directly?
Well, when you grow up on a ship, I talked about my initial tour on ships, you're in relatively confined space, several hundred feet with all your people, 24/7 when you're deployed. And so my habit in leadership was to be out and about. I mean, you can actually isolate yourself on a ship as well. That was not me. And to be in the trenches with the troops to try to understand, was my guidance clear in what we're doing? That's one. And two, do you have what you need to do it? And three, are we actually doing what we said we'd do? One of the things that, and again, back to teaching here, that I talked to these young midshipmen here who are about to become commissioned, is the training piece. I mean, one of the reasons that the bin Laden raid was so successful is because of the training, because of the dozens of times that same team had practiced this raid in various places in various ways. So training, which sometimes can be a huge challenge for all of us, can you make it realistic? Does it really have the meaning? I just can't emphasize that enough, because that becomes the base for success in a real tragedy, in a real crisis. So from that standpoint, the idea that I would, and in fact, I was surprised to get the job as chairman. I was 2 years into a 4-year tour as the head of our Navy, and political crossfires occurred, and my predecessor, General P. Pace, got put right in the middle of that political crossfire and was not going to be able to be confirmed. So Gates and President Bush asked me to take that job. I was a sailor in 2 ground wars, so I got to get on the ground, and I got young ones who are dying and who are being badly wounded, families that are being affected, and I want to know a lot about that, along with my wife, who was very invested on the family side. So no better way for me than to get on the ground and get as far out, as close to the fight as I could get. Now, it's not very realistic to see that any 4-star is going to get out in the fight. But in addition to talking to the field leadership, I wanted to talk to the troops. And I never went anywhere without having some kind of all hands call, so I could listen to them. And part of being a leader, and you hear this conversation, or this idea, truth to power, easier said than done. But part of what I knew I had to do was break through that, so the young kids who are 18, 19, 20 years old would feel comfortable asking me a question that is tied to improving the field hospital capability, improving the air mechanics, aviation mechanic in the Apache squadron who needs tools and more people, and understanding that, and they would be comfortable enough to ask me the question, what about? I can remember in Afghanistan, as we were shifting from Iraq to Afghanistan, an Army sergeant who stood up, who'd been in Iraq, and said, look, these MRAPs, which are these mine-resistant vehicles that save lives, the ones that we had in Iraq were nice, but they don't get around the mountains here in Afghanistan very well. Literally, that question was right at the center of redesigning our MRAPs, which we did very rapidly to provide them the MRAPs that would help them in the mountainous terrain that Afghanistan, for example. That's so being on the ground, and I would go out there about every 3 months to the war zone to see the leadership for sure, but every bit as important was to see the troops on the ground.
Yeah, wow. I had the privilege to see you speak several times, and I have to say, it actually was not always easy conversations. I have, seen examples where you had members of your teams that were saying, we have these needs, Admiral, and we need your support on it. And I think that one of the things when you're leading such a large, organization is the ability to have those sorts of difficult conversations. And I actually wanted to go back to a conversation that I could not imagine how challenging it was to have. But going back one last time to the bin Laden raid, after you all successfully exit Pakistan, someone has to call the government of Pakistan and have that conversation. And my understanding is you were the person who did that. Can you briefly talk about what that was like?
Yeah, I had invested actually under President Bush, so a long time before this night, but I had invested a lot of my time with trips to Pakistan to interact with the individual, the general who effectively was my counterpart. The most powerful person in Pakistan is the chief of staff of the army. And it's been that way for a long time. And I was driven by the scars of my youth, which is Vietnam. I'm a Vietnam vet. One of the reasons we didn't win in Vietnam is because we have the safe havens in Laos and Cambodia. And effectively, what Pakistan was a safe haven for a lot of terrorist leadership, including the leadership of the Taliban. So I needed Pakistan to do as much as they possibly could to make it difficult and eliminate leadership havens on the Pakistani side. And that's a really fraught undertaking. But I can remember, and his style, this guy's name was Ashfaq Kiani. His style was to sit down for a one-on-one dinner at his quarters when I would visit Pakistan. And it's in those interchanges, including the first one that I had, which was late 2007 or early 2008. And my message to him was, look, and I wasn't being told to do this, and nobody told me it was true. I said, but if we find number one or number two, bin Laden or al-Zawahiri in Pakistan, there's not a president of the United States, whoever it is, whatever party, that isn't going to come and get him. I repeated that time and time and time again. And I think I made some 27 trips to Pakistan over the course of the 4 years. So that we would come in was not a surprise to him. And I had a good relationship with him. So yes, it was a very difficult conversation. But really, he answered the phone. There were a couple aspects of this which were really critical. He answered the phone by saying, I understand there's some good news. So he thought that we had killed bin Laden. And I just confirmed that. Another part, because it's like 2, 3 in the morning there, or 4 in the morning, maybe by the time I talked to him, the sun was starting to come up and Twitter was starting to go off. And he said, when are you going to announce this? Well, we hadn't made that decision yet, whether our president was going to announce it that night or the next day. And he pushed me hard. He said, look, you need to get this out there because he's going to have to answer a lot of mail as soon as questions start coming his way about what happened. So I literally took that back to President Obama, and that was obviously a part of his consideration in terms of making the decision to announce it to the American people in the world, that night. And then the other thing that happened was, because it was a very embarrassing situation for Pakistan and for the armed forces and for the army in particular. General Kiani had a really tough couple of weeks with his people, with the military in particular, because of that embarrassment. So it was a hard conversation, but it was preceded. It wasn't a cold call. It was preceded by an awful lot of work over the course of the last few years in terms of establishing a relationship, so I could make a call like that. One other thing I'd say, just quickly about that night, I saw Admiral Eric Olson, who was a Navy 4-star that ran the Special Operations Command. So he's down in Tampa during this raid. And what I heard Olson say maybe a month or month and a half later publicly, which surprised me a little bit. In addition to the bin Laden operation, there were 14 operations like that night in Afghanistan. And I had seen operations like that over and over and over again when I would go to Afghanistan, go to Bagram, I would visit the Special Forces leadership. So part of my recommendation, part of my understanding of where we were, was I had embedded myself as a leader in the special operations world and watched these operations for months and years, which again gave me great confidence that putting this team together, they could execute this mission.
Yeah. I mean, so many themes and lessons to extract from your wisdom here, Admiral Mullen, but certainly right, like the getting to the pointy end, getting out in the field, taking that expertise back so that you could provide a recommendation on the activities to provide here, right? Obviously, like the consistency in your relationship. Yeah. thank you for sharing.
Just actually one other thing, because I know this is also focused on change and leadership and technology. And I mean, we in the military, we have our tribes. We've got our 4 services. Each of the services has different tribes. In the Navy, it's the ship group, and it's the submariners and the aviators and others as well. That's true in the Air Force, where you have the strategic nuclear group, and the fighter group, F-15, F-16, et cetera. And the Army's got nothing but tribes as well. And we all struggle with, how do you bring barriers down? I will tell you that when lives are on the line, barriers fall. Nobody knows, nobody cares where it came from. If I'm trying to get a helicopter to a wounded soldier, sailor, airman, or Marine, and get him into the field hospital quickly. And so when you do not have that emergency, how does a leader create a sense of urgency, the same sense of urgency, to drop the barriers so that we can have the biggest impact over the shortest period of time? Yeah. And that's a real challenge.
Yeah. Well, I want to transition to one last topic here. Sure. In the few minutes we have left, and that is, since we have this unique audience of Silicon Valley tech leadership and public safety leadership from across the United States and really across North America, I'd love to spend a few minutes on how you thought. I mean, you were known for kind of technical leadership throughout your time in the armed services, and I wanted to kind of maybe pick one of the most complicated, sophisticated programs, at least based off my understanding. That is the Aegis Combat System. I think this was a 20+ year endeavor to build what was described to me as hitting a speeding bullet, except I think it's actually faster than a speeding bullet, with another speeding bullet 100 miles away. So the number of constituents that you had to line up around this vision, right? And my understanding is the number of people who said this wasn't possible when as you were kind of driving that forward. Can you talk a little bit about how you align so many different groups around a common vision on the technology side?
Well, as many people know, we can sometimes really struggle in the Pentagon with developing programs, and they are very expensive, and oftentimes they run over schedule. But this was an evolution that turned out to be a revolution. And the reason I say that, and this is a big lesson learned, is this was the major piece of technology, was the radar itself, and the technical components of the radar that were involved. And then and there was a guy named Admiral Wayne Meyer that put all this together. And then what Meyer did was take the best of current technology and then add it to, so he took the best missile, the best fire control system, that aspect of it, and joined it with this radar. And that's why I say it was an evolution which then revolutionized our air defense world, which is where this started. And it involved an air defense of the aircraft carrier, if you will, initially. That then evolved through another visionary leader by the name of Admiral Rod Remp into ballistic missile defense, which is what you're talking about, a bullet hitting a bullet. That then went to the other services, the Army and the Air Force. And in fact, it's extended to this day to the systems which are ashore in Poland and Romania for missile defense in that part of the world, as well as out in the Western Pacific with Japan and with South Korea, for example. And it's part of the system now that protects the U.S. So it was the genius of this Admiral Meyer. Now, this is anathema to me to some degree, because I used to handle all the money as well. But what Meyer had was lots of money, lots of congressional support, and just a fierce dedication to bringing about this system. The other individual in my lifetime that did this was Rickover before Meyer in the nuclear Navy. Same kind of thing. So it was that, and Meyer was there for a long time. He wasn't rotated. So he had the vision and he saw it through, which was really key. My participation in that was as a leader, was to understand the technology well enough so I could explain it, so I could resource it, and I could defend it, which is a really important part of it. And that's true now for any leader, any line leader, if you're talking about cyber, if you're talking about autonomy, if you're talking about AI is it's coming. It's not coming, it's here. Leaders have to understand what the capability is, because you hire the people, provide the resources, write the policies, and defend it, if you will, in your own area. So there's very significant similarities with respect to that. What I don't want to do is learn a lot about AI after a monstrous catastrophe and crisis. And that's very possible because AI is coming so fast. I think we've got 48, maybe 48 months, maybe 5 years. That's it. And AI is going to change the world in a very positive way. I understand all that. What I'm focused on is wherever you have these technologies, bad guys get their hand on it, and they're going to work against us as fast as they can. And we need to be able to get ahead of them in terms of using AI to thwart what they're doing or what they will do when they figure it out.
Yeah. Just as we wrap here, I want to try to merge those points on technology with where we started and think specifically about this incredibly challenging role leading kind of these mission critical first response teams across the United States, where you're talking about limited budgets, rising emergency volume between all, aging populations, climate change, gun violence. There's more pressure than ever on these teams. And there's often under resources, small budgets, et cetera. Any advice, as we wrap here, for folks leading in that sort of environment?
Just a couple comments with respect to technology, and I'll use Ukraine as an example. I mean, Ukraine has in many ways been the results there have been driven by sort of advances in technology to a certain extent. You hear about drones, you hear about AI, obviously the Starlink piece with communications, et cetera. But I'm also struck by the number of references to World War I trench warfare. And the message, and also some of these quote unquote very expensive systems like HIMARS, for example, and ATACMS, which just got introduced, and F-16s, which will come. All those systems are not current, they're not brand new systems. So where I am, and it's sort of where I am in life, there's a balance here. You're not going to solve all of current day's problems with new technology, and we need to be careful when we walk away from an older technology, if you will. And I get beat up all the time about aircraft carriers. Well, look at what's going on right now with aircraft carriers in the Middle East as a deterrent, given what's very tragically happened in Israel just in the last couple of weeks. So I'm not saying we shouldn't leave old technology behind, but we need to be smart about it from that standpoint. So the idea that you can just sort of cartoon in a new technology and it will change the game forever, that doesn't happen. At least in my view, that doesn't happen. You got to be very, very careful. And then with respect to the undermanned, under-resourced, do more with less, et cetera. I mean, I've been doing that my whole life. My answer to that is a leader needs to have a small cell of individuals who are brilliant and looking at ways to do things differently. They can go off and study it. They can run a prototype on it. You as a leader don't have time to do this, but you've got, before we started, you showed me the display of the phone calls in the LA area in the last 24 hours. How do you break that down? And how do you know what's really important? We have to figure out how can we become more effective and more efficient with new technology, with new processes, given those constraints, because the environment you just described is not going to change. We're going to be under-resourced. We're going to be under pressure. We've got to respond because of the crisis requirement. So how do you create a cell which can give you ideas on technology or people or organization that can change to meet what you see? There's always going to be too much to do and not enough to do it with.
Well, Admiral Mullen, your leadership steering our nation through this incredible period of change in light of those challenges and so many challenges. I grew up in it, watching you on TV, following your lessons of leadership, and spent a few minutes with you today with such an incredible and important group of people in the audience here. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for sharing that wisdom and for all you've done for our country and our world.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks for what you guys are doing too. It's really critical. So I look forward to very effective, fast, exceptionally good results. Thanks.
Thank you.